Let's have the story from Foiled again. You need to listen really carefully because the clues are within the text. But can you spot the mistakes that the villain makes? That means they end up being foiled again. Today's story is called The Perfect Theft. Ferdinand Mount was one of the cleverest jewel thieves in the world, and the theft of the famous Denton diamond, worth over £500,000, from the Honourable Mrs. Sophie Denton, was going to be the cleverest crime of his career. Oh. That was what he told himself anyway, and he had good reason for thinking he was right. He had prepared the ground extremely carefully, disguising himself as one Charles Bailey, the son of a millionaire businessman, who conveniently happened to be out of the country at the time. He'd got himself introduced to Mrs. Denton at a party, and they soon became friends. After that, Ferdinand, or Charles as he now called himself, frequently visited Mrs. Denton at her luxury flat in Bruton Street, Mayfair, and before long he was asking her to let him have a glimpse of her famous diamond. "That's if it's not stored away in the vaults of some bank," he said with a grin. "Of course it isn't," Sophie Denton laughed. "What's the use of having a beautiful stone if no one ever sees it except the vault keepers, or whatever they're called? I always have the diamond right here." They were talking in a flat, in the room she called her study. It was an odd room, as full of collector's pieces as a Bond Street antique shop. Across one wall was a shelf on which were arranged 2 flintlock pistols, 2 ivory elephants from India, a wooden giraffe, probably from Africa, a couple of bronze Siamese cats, and a large Chinese willow pattern plate. The plate was at the back of the shelf, and Mrs. Denton had to move the other objects to get to it. She put them carefully on the carpet beneath the shelf. Then she gingerly took down the plate, revealing behind it the small circular door of a safe. In the centre of this door was a knob, which obviously worked a combination lock. Ferdinand pretended to look away as Mrs. Denton operated the knob, but out of the corners of his eyes he noted exactly how many times she turned it. 3 times to the left, 4 to the right, 7 to the left, then 9 to the right. The safe door swung open with a click, and the next moment Mrs. Denton had taken out the famous diamond and was holding it in front of his eyes. It was a huge stone, nearly 10 centimetres wide, and it shimmered and sparkled with all the colours of the rainbow, but coldly, like an aurora borealis trapped in ice. I don't think I said that right. "I'm sorry I can't hurt you hold it, Charles, my dear," Mrs. Denton said. "The insurance men are most particular that no one should actually touch it except me." Ferdinand beamed. "It's enough of a thrill for me to see such a beautiful thing," he said, although actually he was so anxious to get his hands on it that he could feel his fingers itching. Mrs. Denton put the stone back in the safe, closed the door, put the plate back in front of it, and then rearranged the objects on the shelf in exactly the order they'd been in before. "If I ever see these things in a different order," she said, "I know someone's been at the safe." "Very clever of you," Ferdinand murmured, and hurriedly committed the order to memory. P-E-G-E-C-C-P, he told himself. Pistol, elephant, giraffe, elephant, cat, cat, pistol. He went away from the flat, chortling. He'd not only seen the stone, but knew now exactly where it was kept, and had even been shown the combination of the safe. There was something else too. He had had a miniature camera hidden in his breast pocket, and had taken a close-up snap in full colour of the magnificent stone. As soon as the photograph was developed, he took it to one of Wilberforce Lazaro, the most skillful forger of gems in London. In return for a little matter of £10,000, Lazaro made him a copy of the Denton diamond in paste. Such a brilliant copy that only an expert could have told the difference. Mrs. Denton was always holding parties at her flat, and since Ferdinand, as her dear Charles, had become such a close friend of hers, he was naturally invited to the next one. The party was held in the largest room in the flat, which Mrs. Denton called the drawing room. The study was not being used that evening and was dark and deserted. But Ferdinand tried the door and found that it wasn't locked. All he had to do, he told himself, was wait until late in the evening, when most of the guests had a lot to drink, and no one would notice if he slipped away for a couple of minutes. He reckoned that would be quite enough time to take the diamond from the safe and slip the fake one in its place. If he didn't make any mistakes, it might be months before anyone realised that a robbery had taken place. And by then, it would be far too late for the police to work out when and how the stone had been taken, let alone by whom. Mrs. Denton rather prided herself on her singing voice, and was starting to give a selection of numbers from popular musicals accompanied on the piano by a well-known composer. The piano was at the opposite end of the drawing room from the door that led into the study. As all the guests were crowding round Mrs. Denton and her star pianist, no one so much as glanced around as Ferdinand slipped across the room and nipped through the study door. The first thing he did was to close the door silently behind him. Next, he clicked on the lights and pulled out from his pocket the £10,000 fake Denton diamond. It was almost as good as the original at shimmering with all the colours of the rainbow, but it didn't have quite the frosty grandeur of the real stone. It looked like an aurora borealis trapped in water rather than ice. I don't think I said that right. Ferdinand put the fake gingerly back in his pocket. Then he crossed to the shelf where the safe was hidden. Just in time, he remembered about fingerprints and donned a pair of black leather gloves before touching any of the objects on the shelf. One by one, he put the objects quietly down on the carpet. As quietly as he could, that is. The bronze Siamese cats fell against each other with a loud clink. Fortunately, at that moment, Mrs. Denton was practically raising the roof with an off-key rendering of "I could have danced all night." Above that, no one could have heard a bomb exploding, let alone a couple of cats clinking. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Ferdinand gently removed the pillow pattern plate, put it on the carpet beside one of the flintlock pistols, and started to work the knobs on the safe. What was it now? 3 turns to the left, 4 to the right, 7 to the left, then 9 to the right? The safe clicked open without trouble, and the next moment he'd switched the 2 stones and held the real Denton diamond, all £500,000 worth of it, in his gloved hands. Very, very carefully, he slipped it into his pocket and just clicked the safe shut when something terrifying happened. Mrs. Denton had finished wishing to dance all night. The guests had politely applauded, and the sounds outside had dropped to a babble of general talk. But 2 voices in that babble suddenly became very loud and distinct, and Ferdinand realised it was a couple talking right outside the study door. What was more, they were obviously planning to come in. The handle of the door slowly turned. Ferdinand acted faster than ever before in his long career as a thief. In a flash, he was over by the door, clicking off the lights. A split second later, he was removing the bulbs from the 2 lampstands that illuminated the room. The door opened. The light switch clicked. "Oh, the lights must have fused," a voice said. "We'd better not go in. We might knock over one of Mrs. D's collector's pieces." The door closed again, but the couple remained just outside, talking. Ferdinand replaced the bulbs, but didn't dare switch on the lights again. Fumbling in the dark, he picked up the ornaments one by one and put them back on the shelf, taking care to keep to the order he'd memorised. P-E-G-E-N-T. CCP. Pistol, elephant, giraffe, elephant, cat, cat, pistol. Then he crept silently across the room until he was just beside the door and waited, his heart pounding. At last, the couple moved away, and to his great relief he heard the piano start again. Mrs. Denton was given an encore, which meant that everyone would be crowding at the other end of the drawing room, and his way was clear to leave. Having committed what he believed was the perfect theft, he walked to the door and stepped out into the drawing room. In fact, though, he'd made 3 very serious blunders, which between them made certain he'd soon be behind bars. But what 3 mistakes did he make? Take a minute now to think. If you need to pause the video, do so. If you want to rewind the video, do so. But we'll meet back here in a moment to find out what 3 mistakes, what 3 blunders did he make. Oh. So, do you think you've spotted the 3 clues, those 3 mistakes that the villain made? Let's find out, see if you're right. Well done for having a guess if you did. It'd be incredible if you got the clues right. You'd make a great detective. Here's clue number 1. Ferdinand had forgotten to take off those black rubber gloves, and he's slipping out of the study into the drawing room still wearing them. They're not exactly the correct wear for smart West End parties, and if anyone sees him with them or slipping them into his pockets, they're going to ask some very awkward questions. Ugh. Mistake number 2. Even if Ferdinand pockets the gloves without being seen, he's still not out of trouble. The next time she goes into the study, Mrs. Denton will see at a glance that someone has been at the safe because, although he replaced all the other items in order, in the darkness, he completely forgot about the willow pattern plate, the most important ornament of the lot, because it was actually hiding in the safe. Ooh. Mistake number 3. You might say that even if the robbery is spotted, there's still nothing to point to Ferdinand being the thief, as long as nobody spotted the gloves, that is. But the first thing the police are going to do is examine the fake diamond, and Ferdinand has left his fingerprints all over that, because if you remember, he examined it before he put the gloves on.